is taken from the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the good will of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. Well, it's certainly no secret that in our current time, things are very divided, right, in our country and in the world, all right? And it is easy when people are talking about these divisions to have analysts try and categorize everybody into, different categories. And so, you see this, something like this, right? Republican, Democrat, or Independent. You see 45, 27, 27. But the thing is, what do these labels even mean? All right, because nobody, or you shouldn't, agree with your party 100% of the time. Okay? Nobody should agree with it 100% of the time. And, are independents really independent? Most of the independents I know actually aren't. They have a really strong lean way or the other. I mean, Bernie Sanders is an independent. Okay? But there's clearly a lean, all right? And, so my point is that labels aren't necessarily useful, all right, for actually describing how people should be, and it's not useful for us in determining how we are supposed to act, because labels lead us to make inaccurate presumptions about people. So what happens is you have a person say something and a label gets applied to them, and then what happens is people extrapolate from that label into all kinds of other viewpoints that the person may or may not hold. For example, I know Democrats who are very much in favor of gun rights, and I know Republicans who are very much in favor of reasonable gun control, okay? So I know people who take positions that are very much opposite of the label that they would identify themselves as holding, all right? And so the problem with labels is that it fails to appreciate the extent to which people are complex and people are nuanced, and the issues that face the world are complicated and nuanced, okay? And instead, what happens is when we just lump things into labels, they end up artificially constraining our thinking. So we apply labels to people, and sometimes people apply labels to themselves, and those labels are way too broad. All right, for example, here's one that would happen in school. Are you good at math? Okay, so that would be a simple question. Are you good at math? All right. I'm Korean. The answer was yes, but what can I say? All right, but what does that mean? Okay, for example, good at math. Maybe if I sat there and said, okay, what's 23 times 17? Some of you are just like, boom, I know the number right away. And then I go, oh, so you're good at math. I have these differential equations I'd like to solve. Can you help me with that? Good at math. Does that mean you're good at algebra, and also you're good at geometry? Or maybe you're really only good at one or the other, okay? And so even a simple label like that can constrain people's perceptions of you, and it can constrain your perceptions of yourself. If you sit there and say that I'm not good at math, then you may just not even try doing all kinds of things that are mathematically related, even though math is a big subject. All right, math is a really wide area. Same thing goes for science or music or whatever it is that's out there. The label is too broad. The label is broader than what it is, and if you start to apply the label to yourself, then it can artificially constrain your thinking. You apply the label to others, and you artificially constrain the way you perceive them because you impute to them everything underneath the umbrella of the label. So labels constrain our thinking, and labels can lead us to unquestioningly accept things or unquestioningly reject things. Which leads me to one of the more, I wouldn't say controversial, but it's a verse that usually leads to some considerable level of discussion, all right, which is in this passage. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. All right, a lot of people in North America read this verse and they cringe a little bit. Okay? So they read this, and so one of the questions that I often get if this comes up in a Bible study, you have someone to go, wait a second. Are you saying Jesus was a socialist? And first, my answer is pretty simple. I doubt he was an adherent of any economic theory that wouldn't be invented for another 1800 years. Okay? I mean, socialism appears in the early 1800s in the aftermath of the French Revolution. Okay? So first of all, the label itself didn't exist in Jesus's time. But one of the other issues that's important is to ask this question. So this is usually the question I ask back. So after the person says, well, was Jesus a socialist? And of course, by the way, the person who asks that usually has a certain pejorative view of the term. And I'll say, well, that's actually not the correct question. The real question I have for you is this. If he was one, would you become one? That's the question that I ask, because the real question is not what label are you trying to apply to Jesus, but the question is, where's your hierarchy on determining what your views are going to be? Is your hierarchy saying that no matter what Jesus says to do, what Jesus leads me to believe, how Jesus leads me to act, I'm going to say yes to that because it's what Jesus wants me to do? Or am I going to approach every situation and say that in the real world, here's what I believe, and I have to make my faith fit underneath what I believe about the real world? Where is your hierarchy? Are you going to let secular constraints determine the extent to which you're going to follow Jesus? Are your secular viewpoints defining your faith? Or is your faith defining how you're going to see the world and how you're going to move through the world? See, there are a lot of people who have the opinion who live in such a way that they say, you know what, if Jesus espouses something that is in opposition to my worldview, then I'm not going to believe that. Then I'm not going to accept that. All right? Whereas the views of Jesus, the way Jesus teaches us to be, are supposed to be the ways in which we see the world. So when we have all kinds of issues in our world that have moral implications, are we going to pursue war or are we going to pursue peace? Is there going to be capital punishment? What should economics, look like? All of these questions that confront us in the real world, our attitude as followers of Jesus has to be that I'm simply going to go in the direction Jesus leads me to go. And in so many ways, the way Jesus is going to lead us to go are going to defy secular labels. Okay. You can't assign Jesus to a political party. You can't assign Jesus to an economic system. You can't assign Jesus to anything. In so many different ways, Jesus is leading us in directions that counter what we believe in the secular world. To give you a simple example, there's absolutely no indication anywhere that heaven is anything but a dictatorship. It's not a democracy. Like, angels don't vote, okay, and decide how they're going to go, okay, all right? God says this is how things are going to be, and guess what? That's how things are going to be, okay? The reason why that works in heaven and doesn't work on earth is because earthly dictators aren't God. They don't have God's wisdom. They don't have God's love. They don't have God's care for the people, and that's why it doesn't work. So if you start to apply secular thinking and try to fit theological thinking into a secular worldview, it doesn't work. Because we all would sit there and we recoil at the idea of living under a dictatorship. We give thanks all the time that we don't live under a dictatorship. Unless I'm in heaven, then I'm okay with it. Okay? When I die and go to be with the Lord, be like, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, whichever one. Doesn't, I'm, okay? That's not the constraint. It's going to be like, yes, God. Yes, God, whatever you say, God. I will do whatever you say. You're in charge. I don't get to vote. I just get to obey. Because that's the system that works when God's in charge, which is not the system that works when people are in charge. Because on earth, we have a lot of people who think they're God, but none of them are. All right? And so we don't want to get ruled by that. Right? So the question becomes, are you letting your secular thinking constrain the way you're going to think about what it means to follow God in the world? Because putting limits on our faithfulness, putting those secular limits on the extent to which we're going to follow God, ends up limiting Jesus' ability to transform us. As soon as I sit there and say, hey, I'm not going to do this, I don't care what the Bible says. By the way, I've heard that in churches from church leaders in different churches who've said, well, I don't care what the Bible says, that just doesn't work. And it's like, oh, wait a second. wait a second. All right. But as soon as we say, I can only be stretched so far, then we're saying to Jesus, okay, change me, but not too much. Change me, but only within limits. Okay? We even have a joke among clergy about the way God's going to stretch you, which is that the minute you hear a pastor say something like, I love being the pastor of a church, but man, I just would never want to be called to a developing nation. Our answer to them is, pack your bags. Pack your bags, friends, because guess where you're probably going to be stretched. But even in my profession, as a clergy person, we have a joke about the fact that clergy are often ignoring the voice of God and where they go. We go, isn't it amazing how pastors only seem to get called to higher paying churches? Whenever they start talking about, I'm just going to go where God calls me next. Somehow, some way, it just seems to be that they hear the voice of God calling them to that bigger church next. Change me, but not too much. Change me, but in the direction I want to go. But the thing is, the disciples were ready to be transformed. All right, so they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship. The centerpiece of their lives was learning and fellowship, and faith was at the center as opposed to having faith as an add-on. And that's the difference in the way we're going to view the world. All right, we either go into the world and say that my faith is going to define my worldview. My faith is going to define the way I look at the world. And I'm going to look at the world through the lens of a faith that is defined by love, that is defined by grace, that is defined by compassion, that is defined by generosity, and that I'm going to follow regardless of what the world says. Or I'm going to have my worldview, and I'm going to be wedded to my worldview, and I'm going to rely on faith to only work on me within the constraints of that worldview. But the disciples had approached it by saying, no, we're going to devote ourselves to the teaching. We're going to devote ourselves to one another. And it's really important to see that those two things are both there. All right? Because if it's just they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, then what happens? You become rules-based in the way you approach your faith. Right? They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to their relationships. So it was both the teaching and the relationships that were central to them learning what it meant to follow Jesus. Because remember, at this time in the church's life, they're just figuring it out. The book of Acts is the story of the apostles after Jesus has died, resurrected, and gone to heaven. It's the story of the apostles trying to figure it out. It's basically all it is. It's the story of the apostles trying to figure out what it means for us to live as followers of a risen Christ, who's not sitting among us anymore to tell us what to do. And it's the story of them figuring it out. And they were figuring it out not in a straight line. That's the beauty of the book of Acts, is they are figuring it out, and they're zigging and they're zagging. Wait a second, do converts to Christianity have to become Jewish first? They were trying to figure that out. So they start by saying yes, then they switch over to no. All right. And then they were trying to figure out, hey, does being a follower of Jesus mean that we're still keeping, kosher laws and stuff like that? Started out as yes, and then they decided on no. All right? So they were zigging and zagging their way through trying to figure out what it meant to follow Jesus. But the important thing was that through all those zigs and zags, they said that whatever we had held as our beliefs before are going to be subordinated to what we feel Jesus is leading us to do now. So you had these marks, that these persons who had been born and raised Jewish were raised as markers of their identity. The mark of circumcision among the males, the mark of keeping kosher in the world. That was a way of demonstrating to the world about their faithfulness. They had been taught from the time they were children that this is important to what it means to have an identity in your relationship with God. And then when Jesus' teaching comes around and people feel led by the Holy Spirit, they're like, oh, wait a second, I'm willing to let that go. I'm going to let go what I used to believe, because Jesus has led me to believe something fresh and new. And we have so many instances where the church writ large, has tried to hang on to what it had believed for decades or centuries or even millennia sometimes, and tried to hang on to that because they felt that this was their identity, rather than moving forward into the new world, the new way of thinking, the new way of living that Jesus was leading them to. But you're never going to get there. You're going to put constraints on the ability of Jesus to transform you unless you decide that Jesus is going to define everything else. They lived lives that said, you know what, we're going to live a life that has Jesus at the top, and we're going to let Jesus define how we're going to think. We're going to let Jesus define what we're going to do. We're going to let Jesus define how we're going to live. And their lives didn't necessarily blend in with the world. And so as they were doing this, it says that awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. And it never says exactly what those wonders and signs were. And I actually wonder whether this is just supernatural, because you hear wonders and signs and you think something, that seems magical. You think of something that seems supernatural. But I'm not at all sure that when they say wonders and signs, that they're only talking about supernatural kinds of things, or rather, are they talking about things that result from following Jesus fully? Because following Jesus is extraordinary. If we truly follow Jesus, our lives would be so different. All right? We have tried in the church, especially in the Presbyterian church, we've been trying to follow Jesus into a future that is more expansive and more inclusive and more diverse, and saying we need to be just so impressed by the wonder of the diversity with which God created us, and we want to be a place where that is all welcomed in, and yet we're not fully transformed. We're being transformed. We're not fully transformed. We're trying. But we're not fully transformed yet. We all have these issues within us. But when you look at people who truly try to follow what they believe, it's so extraordinary that they actually kind of become social outcasts in the process. Because in the process of following Jesus, they are doing things that the rest of the world doesn't accept. And a group that has tried to do that and has sort of become outcast in the process are the Amish. All right. And if you remember, it's 20 years ago this year that there was that horrific shooting at an Amish school in central Pennsylvania, in the Lancaster area. Okay, so if you remember that horrific shooting, there were five victims, and in fact, a sixth victim only succumbed 2 years ago to the wounds that they had suffered in that shooting. But if you remember the story of that horrific shooting at that school, the Amish responded with extraordinary forgiveness, to the point where they were criticized, including being criticized by Christians for being too forgiving. Yes, oxymoron, but it's there. All right? Because what the Amish did was they had been victimized. 5 young children had been killed in this school, and the shooter took his own life. And what the Amish saw, well, the shooter did a horrific thing, but the shooter left behind a widow and left behind parents. And they went to the widow. And they not only forgave, but they helped. They actually raised money to help. They went to both the shooter's parents and the shooter's in-laws to comfort them over the loss of a person. Because one of the things that we see in the world, right, parents can be very disappointed with what their children do, but they never stop loving their children. Right? Which is kind of such a wonderful metaphor for God. God's disappointed with me every day, but never stops loving me every day. God can be disappointed with you every day and never stop loving you for even a moment in that time. So they went and did that. And you had Christians who said, this wasn't right. Because the shooter didn't express any remorse. And the Amish were just like, no, we're supposed to forgive. Jesus said to forgive. Right? And it isn't even about them, it's about us. It's about us being faithful. It's about us doing the right thing. And Jesus called us to forgive, and didn't say forgive with limits, didn't say forgive unless you go too far, didn't say forgive only if they express remorse. Jesus just said forgive. And so they did. And they took the criticism as a result. Because they had decided that what Jesus was leading them to do and how Jesus was leading them to live was more important than what the world said about it. And when they lived that way, when people lived that way, when the early church lived this way, they got the goodwill of all the people. Yeah, it's one of the things, when I think about the Amish, it's one of the things about them. Most of us probably would not choose to live that way. All right, I have my cell phone surgically attached. It would be very difficult, for me to live in that way. But there's one thing, I don't know, maybe I don't live in that area, but I don't know anybody who doesn't like them. I know people who may think, oh, that's strange, that's different, they live differently, whatever, I wouldn't live that way, but I don't know anybody who doesn't like them. Because they live lives that are so devoted to what they believe, and so devoted to not hurting others, and so devoted to being forgiving. And so the apostles devoted themselves to the teachings of Jesus, no matter what it led them to do, whether it led them to dispossess themselves of their things or whether it led them to whatever, to go places they wouldn't have gone. People were inspired by them. And the question is, how would we get to that place where we would inspire people through our faith? And I think it starts by approaching faith with the right questions. See, right answers depend on asking right questions. And too often we use questions that end up framing boundaries, framing limits, framing answers in such a way that you're not going to get a useful answer. It's like early on when I said I often get the question in response to that verse about selling their stuff and giving things away. When they go, is Jesus a socialist? That's the wrong question. It's not a good question to ask. It doesn't lead to a useful answer. Sometimes people talk about an action, and I've mentioned this in sermons many times. The worst question to ask about an action is it a sin? The reason why it's a bad question is because as soon as you say that, you're kind of saying, well, if it's not, then everything's okay. That's not. And that's not true. All right? It's kind of like the difference. If you're working on a project at work or whatever, the difference between the question, is this good enough or is this excellent, are two very different questions. And asking the one question has a very different result than the other question. If you just go through life asking if this is good enough, that will make a big difference in how you go through life rather than if you ask the question, is this excellent? Is this the best I could do? And the focus of the gospel is for you to ask the right questions, which is to say, am I doing what Jesus would want me to do? It's not, am I avoiding what Jesus doesn't want me to do? It's, am I doing what Jesus would want me to do? And the reason why Jesus would want you to do it is in the way they talk about the success of the manner in which these disciples lived. It said, and day by day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. The outcome that mattered was people being transformed. It wasn't, and day by day the apostles were holier and holier and holier and holier. Because that wasn't the point. The people were drawn in by the sharing. The people were drawn in by the acceptance. The people were drawn in by the caring. The people were drawn in by the signs and the wonders, not the legalism. Because at the end of the day, the guiding principle of the gospel is people. The rules were nice when Jesus lived. He said, I'm not against the rules. I'm fine. You want to observe the Sabbath? That's great. Oh, until a person's in need and I need to heal them on the Sabbath. Because the Sabbath rule is fine, but there's a higher rule, which is people. What's best for the people is the question that answers, how does Jesus want us to live? What's best for the people? And putting people over rules is a transformative way to think. It's a transformative way to live. But at the end of the day, transformation is the goal of faith. It's for us to really own the love of God for God's people in such a way that we are transformed by it. That we become the people who inspire the world with the sign and wonder of people being willing to love more broadly, love more deeply, love more inclusively than they think is possible or practical. And when we do that, we are transformed as individuals. We are transformed as a community of faith. And through that love, maybe we can transform the world and end those divisions that we love to put labels on, but instead become people who are simply united in our love for one another because we've understood that the guiding principle of faith is people. Amen.